Hey everyone, welcome back. This is part three of Magnolia United Church of Christ Learning Forum, the Constitution 101. Okay, we've done part one, our general introduction of the Constitution, part two, the First Amendment, and tonight we take on our final section, the 14th Amendment. I've had a preview of the slides. It looks really, really good. So we're going to dive in and turn it over to Greg. Greg, just some logistics. Do you want people to jump in with questions or do you want to hold them to the end?
Well, let's take them as they come along. We might not spend too much time on questions because there's so much material to cover, but I do have three question and answer breaks built in. So um, do interrupt and we'll take them as soon as we can.
Okay, perfect.
All
Thank you.
right. Well, thanks, Marcy. The reason we picked the First and the 14th Amendments, or I chose the First and 14th Amendments for this presentation, is that they have more to do with how the Constitution sets up a structure for American culture. We talked about the First Amendment and how we utilize all six of those freedoms in our daily lives. The same is true of the 14th Amendment. It has a lot to say about who we are as a people. Well, the Constitution guarantees to the people a republican form of government, but nobody knows what that means. To this congressman in 1865, a true republic rested upon the absolute equality of a whole people, whether they were high, low, rich, poor, white, or black. And that's where we found ourselves in Congress in 1865 as Congress was debating whether to add another amendment to the US Constitution, which would be the 14th. Let's move to the next slide. The fourth takeaways from tonight's class are that the post-Civil War Reconstruction Amendments, which the United States passed and ratified in 1865 to 1870, represent the biggest historic change in the U.S. Constitution since the Bill of Rights. It is sometimes known as the second founding. It is such a radical change in the U.S. Constitution that it is almost like it was rewritten post-Civil War. Secondly, Jefferson's Declaration of Independence promised that all men were created equal, but the idea of equality does not appear in the U.S. Constitution until the 14th Amendment in 1868. And we'll take a look at what it was like beforehand and what it looks like afterward. Furthermore, the federal government's promise of equal protection, which is where equality comes into the Constitution, again in the 14th Amendment in 1868, would take about a century to realize. We call the interim period Jim Crow. There are a lot of terms for it and a lot of sociological studies on how and why this happened. But until we got the integration of schools and Brown versus School Board in the mid-50s, the 24th Amendment that eliminated the poll tax in 1964 and the Civil Rights Acts of 64 and 65, along with the Voting Rights Act, we didn't really realize the promise of equality that goes all the way back to John Locke. Then we talk about in Jefferson, and then we talk about in the 14th Amendment in 1868. We get it about 100 years later in 1968. Finally, the idea of privacy is a right of the people that isn't specifically listed in the Constitution and therefore is considered an unenumerated right of the people. Unenumerated is a word used in the Ninth Amendment which guarantees that some rights that are not listed in the Constitution that yet might later be found are guaranteed to the people. And what is privacy? It's the right to be left alone. Okay, let's move forward. Slavery has existed, did exist in the colonies and states longer than since it didn't exist. Kind of a roundabout way of saying it existed for 246 years. It ended with the 13th Amendment in 1865, and it has existed now for 160 years since 1865. There's been no slavery. So the period when there was slavery is about 80 years longer, 86 years longer than the period since then when there has not been slavery. For those of you who may have heard of uh, uh, terms that deal with the study of race, uh, one of the very common themes is that an institution that lasted for almost 250 years doesn't go away overnight. And that's why we see this yellow blip here on my graphic. It's called Jim Crow, and it lasts for about 100 years. And this is the period where the states continued to discriminate against individuals. Let's move forward. The word slavery actually does not appear in the original U.S. Constitution. The word slavery doesn't appear until the 13th Amendment in 1865 that abolished slavery. There are three references to the institution of slavery without calling it that. Article 1, Section 2 refers to all other persons, and what it was a mechanism for counting people in the states for purposes of representation in Congress. These people who were enslaved had no vote and had no social services being delivered to them, but yet they were counted for purposes of the census when the states were seeking to have individuals represented in Congress so that the number of representatives in Congress went up. This was called the infamous 3/5 clause. Also in Article 1 in Section 9, the original Constitution said that if importing slaves from other countries, not necessarily the trade of slaves inside the United States, but if imported slaves from other countries ever should be prohibited, it couldn't be prohibited until 1808. What happened was in 1808, Congress passed a law prohibiting the importation of slaves beginning in 1820. Finally, there's a reference to the institution of slavery in Article 4, Section 2, which is called the Fugitive Slave Clause. And what it said was that if an escaped slave should show up in a free state, that free state must turn the slave over to his owner, if you will, for purposes of this discussion, his rightful owner, because he was supposedly property of that individual. So the Fugitive Slave Clause required that escaped slaves or people who were otherwise gone from their owners be returned to them. Let's move forward. It's important that we see, one of the reasons I asked you to look at the rest of the Bill of Rights in our last conference was to take a look at the Ninth Amendment. The Ninth Amendment says that the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny others that are retained by the people. In other words, our list might not be exhaustive. We put all these things, first, second, you've read 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th Amendments. Maybe they didn't get them all, is what Madison is saying. And here what he's saying is if there are other rights that come up, they will be retained by the people. Later, we will talk about the right of privacy. And the right of privacy is based in part on the Ninth Amendment. And in addition, the First, Third, Fourth, and Fifth Amendments. The Ninth Amendment, the right of privacy will lead to a lot of new law in the modern era, including Griswold, which we'll talk about, Roe v. Wade, which most people know what the subject of it was, and Obergefell, which gave us marriage equality. Let's move forward. So the interregnum between the Revolutionary War and the Civil War was long, it was difficult. Here are some of the high points. In 1794, cotton goes from being a very minor part of our export profile to being a significant part of it. And that's because of the invention of the cotton gin. Cotton is, when it comes out of the pod, there's a lot of little seeds in it. It's not marketable with those seeds in it. The gin made it so the seeds could be taken away from the cotton and it became immediately marketable. Before 1794, our primary export was tobacco, also lumber and timber and fish and a number of wheat, a number of other agricultural products. Cotton was a very minor product, but now it could be made massively greater, and in fact would become a significantly greater export almost immediately. You've already read that in 1808, slave imports will cease as of 1820. Also in 1820, we begin to kind of see the beginnings of what will become the Civil War, the Missouri Compromise. says that free states and slave states shall be balanced for purposes of representation in the Senate. It's very important that in 1834, England ends slavery in its entire empire all over the world. That would include places in the Caribbean like Jamaica. And so, United States will remain just about the only place in the Americas with slavery after 1834. In 1842, the Supreme Court comes down with a case that says that the northern states have to obey the Fugitive Slave Clause. The northern states had taken the position that the Fugitive Slave Clause was a creature of federal law. It's in the federal constitution, not in the state constitutions. And therefore, they didn't have to obey it unless the feds wanted to come in and do the dirty work of arresting these runaway slaves and returning them. Instead, a lot of the northern states had what they call personal liberty laws, which allowed individuals who had come from servitude to integrate into the communities and actually for them to be harbored from arrest. Some people became nurses and teachers, and when they were ripped out of their communities, it raised quite a lot um, of bad feelings toward slavery. So in the North, we're beginning to see an anti-slavery animus. Slavery had not been a huge issue during the Constitutional Convention. It came up. There was a division along North and South lines that was repaired, but they largely kicked slavery down the road. And here we are getting ready for it. The Kansas-Missouri Act and Bleeding Kansas we can't go into tonight, but it's almost like a dress rehearsal for the Civil War. In 1857, the Supreme Court issues the worst decision it ever came up with in the Dred Scott decision. For worst decision, it's got a lot of competition, and later on we'll look at one that comes very close to probably the second worst decision the Supreme Court ever came up with in Plessy versus Ferguson. But Dred Scott said that blacks could never become citizens no matter what, even if their grandparents had been free people in the United States ever since before the founding of the United States. In 1860, the election of 1860, Lincoln is elected, and before he takes office in 1861, 7 states in the South will secede. They don't even wait for Lincoln to take office because they have read, they are aware of the things he said during the debates for Senate a couple of years earlier when he was running against Stephen Douglas in Illinois, and some of the things he said on the stump when he was running for president in 1860, and they realize that he is not a friend of slavery. We will eventually get to the Emancipation Proclamation. Let's move forward. This is the election of 1860. As you can see, Lincoln, the Republican candidate, he's only the second Republican candidate that has ever been fielded, and he wins all the states in the North and the West Coast. There is a Whig candidate who wins 3 states there in the Mid-Atlantic, Kentucky, Virginia, and Tennessee. Stephen Douglas is the Northern Democratic candidate. He wins Missouri and a couple other votes. And then the Southern Democratic candidate, Breckinridge, wins the entire South. It is after his loss that the states start seceding, and here's what that looked like. I'm sorry, Marcy, go ahead for the next slide. There we go. Here's what that looks like. South Carolina secedes before the end of the year, followed by all of these other states you see in the Deep South with numbers on them, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. Later, after the first battle at Fort Sumter, Arkansas, Tennessee, South Carolina, and Virginia will secede, and that becomes the Confederate States of America. Importantly, there are 4 slave states that remain in the North. They are Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, and Delaware. Those are states where slavery is not outlawed, but they remain in the Union. These border states were always tipping one way or the other. They weren't fully integrated into the Union forces. In fact, Kentucky for a while had a shadow state government that was friends with the South. Let's move forward. During his first term, there were a lot of people who told Lincoln that he should abolish slavery and free the slaves. And Lincoln took a very cautious approach toward this at first. One of those individuals was Frederick Douglass. He was raised in Maryland. Frederick Douglass was raised on a slave breeding plantation. The Mid-Atlantic states had become suppliers of slave labor for the Deep South. Frederick Douglass escaped, I believe, at about age 20, ended up in the North, and he became very, very well known as an orator. He was extremely articulate advocate of abolition of slavery. And he says here to Lincoln, he says, he's talking about the Southern enslaved person, whom he will refer as the Negro. Is the Negro, is he not a man? Can he not wield a sword? Can he not fire a gun? Can he not march and countermarch and obey others like any other? And he is asking Lincoln to move forward with emancipation. Lincoln is very cautious because he thinks that he doesn't have the power to do this, but he will come around, obviously, to a different conclusion. Let's move forward to the next slide. Another person who was publicly talking to Lincoln was Horace Greeley, who was the editor of an important newspaper in New York City. And he said, we complain, Mr. President, that you know what an abomination slavery is. On the face of the earth, there's not anybody who believes that if this war ends with slavery not being abolished, it would take more than a year for slavery to come right back in the South in its full vigor. There are a lot of abolitionists in the North who became very, very loud in the early 1860s. And let's move forward. So in 1861, the war was not going well for the North. A lot of battles had been lost. In 1862, the North begins to turn the tide, and Lincoln announces, after a particularly good battle for the North, and I believe it was Appomattox, Lincoln announces that on the first day of January, there will be a Emancipation Proclamation. And then on the first day of January, 1863, he announces that all persons held as slaves were in any part of a state that is in rebellion, meaning the Confederate States of America, shall be at that time and forever freed. And here's the key, here's the kicker, here's what's really going on. That the military and naval authorities, he's the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Army and Navy, right, will recognize and maintain the freedom of such persons and will do no act to turn them back to their original owners. The fact that was a huge bargaining chip for the North was that they had a lot of forts and garrisons throughout the South, particularly in Virginia, Tennessee, Kentucky, along the coast of South Carolina, some naval installations. And what the Emancipation Proclamation did was provide a place where formerly enslaved individuals could flee to, and if they fled to these northern outposts, they would not be returned. They would not be sent back. Let's move to the next slide. The benefits of the Emancipation Proclamation, and by the way, simply all it did was say that enslaved persons who showed up at northern forts and garrisons located in the South would not be turned away or not be returned to their owners. Neither the Fugitive Slave Clause nor the Takings Clause, which, again, if you looked at the Bill of Rights between the last class and this class, you may have noticed the very last section of the Fifth Amendment. The Fifth Amendment is kind of a hodgepodge. There's a lot of stuff in there. One of them says that any property that the government takes must be compensated fairly, justly. Basically, we use this during eminent domain hearings, but it also could have applied to slaves. So if slaves had been taken, it could be that the owner of those slaves had a petition against the federal government for just compensation for his property being taken. However, what's the key here? They were no longer in the United States. They no longer had the U.S. Constitution, the protections of the U.S. Constitution. They had left the United States. They couldn't argue the Fugitive Slave Clause. They couldn't argue the Takings Clause or the demand of just compensation because they had their own Constitution, the Confederate States of America Constitution. So the slave owners from states in rebellion could not claim just compensation from another country's Constitution. There are at least three important benefits of the Emancipation Proclamation. The first one was it heavily interrupted the South's economic order. It took away the labor that fueled the plantation system in large part. Now, not all of the slaves, of course, left. It may have been a small but interruptive portion of people who showed up at these forts and garrisons, which, by the way, the reports at the time from the commanders of these is that they were swamped with people who were volunteering for work. Imagine yourself a white slave owner on a plantation. You and your brothers all march off to war, and you leave the estate in the hands of people, laborers of yours, who are going to keep it going. Well, what if they all leave? Obviously, the cash flow of the South's plantation system was falling apart. Emancipation also resulted in new soldiers for the North. And what about these soldiers was different than a battery that came, a company that came from Minnesota or Illinois? These guys knew the South. They grew up there. They knew where the trails were. They knew where the creeks were. They knew where the bridges were. They knew how to get around in the South. They were very valuable soldiers, just as Frederick Douglass had predicted. And finally, there's a strong moral and political advantage to freeing the slaves because it discourages foreign intervention. The South very much would like to have had England come in as an ally in its battle against the North. And they were diplomatically requesting that London join them. Now, as you saw, England had freed their own slaves in 1834. So here we are 30 years later, and the North freeing the slaves makes it almost impossible for England, who was receiving about 85% of the export cotton that came out of the South, to ally themselves militarily with the South because they already had come down on the side of emancipation, and they probably had no business joining the South, who clearly intended to move forward with slavery. And in fact, it was the goal of the South to take Cuba, the Caribbean, and Central America and make a large country entirely of plantations and using slave labor. Let's move forward. So we get the 13th Amendment in 1865, and it says slavery and involuntary servitude are now prohibited in any place in the United States or a place subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, such as territories. And this was very important because the Dred Scott decision had said that territories could harbor, that slavery could exist in the territories. At the time, there was a territory, even Minnesota at the time was a territory. And if you can imagine yourself a skilled laborer, say in Chicago or Milwaukee, you spent your whole career becoming a skilled craftsman, and suddenly you find out that just across the river or across the state line, a plantation is opened up where the labor is free and there's people there doing the same job you do. They're not being paid for it. You're not going to get your wages. You're not going to get the benefits of being a skilled laborer. And so we had a large middle class in the North that begins to see that slavery is a bad thing because it's beginning to compete with their economic security. So the 13th Amendment goes through Congress, and in 1865, it becomes law. And this is the same year that the Civil War ended in Appomattox in early April of that year, 1865. Lincoln is assassinated 5 days after Appomattox. The 13th Amendment that ended slavery becomes law in December of 1865. Ironically, the last state to ratify it so that it becomes law, the 27th state, is Georgia. Why would Georgia ratify the 13th Amendment? The answer is that Lincoln had mandated that any state that wanted to rejoin the United States had to accept the 13th Amendment. So the southern states, in some cases, ratified the 13th Amendment before some of the northern states did, ironically. So people thought that the 13th Amendment would free the slaves and of also the inequities of the caste system that it had established, that they would disappear. As free people, the formerly enslaved folks would immediately get access to all the benefits of citizenship, right? Things like education and the ability to hold a job and contract for their labor. Well, not so fast. Remember that all that good Madisonian language about the states retaining the power to control the health, safety, and welfare of the people. Remember how Madison sold the idea of the Constitution to the ratifying conventions back in 1788? He said, wait a minute, the states are still going to have all this power over health, safety, and welfare, police powers. The powers of the federal government will be
I don't
few.
know where we are in this.
Hello? He said the powers of the federal government will be few and limited. And what happened was that um, the ratification assemblies, due to their learning all this Madisonian language, approved the Constitution. Well, the states did have control over the welfare of their citizens, and many of them simply denied the benefits of freedom to persons of color in things like education and the ability to contract or start a business, or even court rights like serving on a jury or bringing a court case or being a witness in court. Even marriage contracts in some states, Black people couldn't marry. So in the nation, suddenly there were somewhere between 3.9 and 4 million new citizens, most of them in the South. These were formerly enslaved people. Somehow they had to integrate into society, and they needed to be provided for in some fashion. In many cases, their civil rights, however, were not recognized, and that included voting rights. If you remember, the Bill of Rights is written in terms of restricting what Congress can do and what rights are reserved to the people as against the federal government. As you recall, for instance, the First Amendment says Congress shall make no law that does such and such. The ratifiers of the Constitution demanded a Bill of Rights, as you know, in order to keep the federal government from becoming too strong. But what about the state governments? When they became bad actors, when they began acting like the kings or the parliaments that Congress were, that the people were trying to get rid of back in 1788. Again, the Madisonian language preferring the states as against the federal government left vast holes in the ability of Congress to regulate the states. And that's the reason that we get the 14th Amendment. Let's move forward to the 14th Amendment. We are not going to get into the other sections of the 14th Amendment tonight, but the first section is extremely important. And what we see here is four really important parts. Well, just three, even though it looks like four because those are the ones in bold. Sadly, one of them will be written out of the Constitution by the Supreme Court in a decade or two. But in this first amendment, I'm sorry, the first section of the 14th Amendment, we see that we have first what's known as birthright citizenship. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction are citizens of the United States and the state where they reside. Well, who were they aiming at here? What was the point of birthright citizenship? Anybody care to hazard a guess? The slaves had no country. People who were enslaved were not citizens. They were certainly not given the rights of citizens. They couldn't claim that they were a citizen of the country that their great grandfather came from, Ghana or Jamaica or someplace like that. They were not recognized as citizens of the United States. As of the first sentence of the first section of the 14th Amendment, if they were born here or naturalized here, they now are citizens. So there are 4 million new citizens with a stroke of a pen. We get this privileges and immunities clause, but unfortunately it goes away in a few years. So we're not going to get into that. That's a whole different subject. But then after the semicolon, here come the two real principal pillars of the 14th Amendment. No state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So life, we know what life is. Property, we got a pretty good idea what property is. Liberty, it certainly means staying out of jail. What else could it mean? That's when what we will find as we get into the later parts of this lecture is all the different things that liberty will come to mean as it is used in this phrase of the 14th Amendment. And after that semicolon, another pillar of the 14th Amendment, no state shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction equal protection. Now, first notice that the latter half of this paragraph is directed not toward the federal government, the way the First Amendment is, Congress shall make no law. This is directed toward the states. The states had become the bad actors. That's why we had the Confederate States of America, at least according to Congress in 1865. The second thing is these broad terms, it's soaring language, life, liberty, property, equal protection, due process. These are open-ended terms. They were written that way on purpose so that the courts could breathe life into them later, and Congress could breathe life into them later and say, for instance, what process is due? What laws get equal protection and what is equal protection? Let's move forward to the next slide. The goals of the 14th Amendment were, first of all, to abolish all legislation in the United States which created first and second class citizens. All three of the clauses that I just pointed out to you do this work. The first one, birthright citizenship, does away with the idea that if you were born here, you weren't a citizen. The second one, due process, says that with regard to life, liberty, and property, before the state can adjudicate something of yours, there has to be some safeguards, some processes. You're going to be treated just like every other person who goes through the same type of process, the adjudication. And the third clause, the Equal Protection Clause, does the same work because the Equal Protection Clause says that we will all be treated equally. There will not be one group that has more rights than the other. So there are no second-class citizens. The second goal of the 14th Amendment was to place broad and comprehensive limits on the powers of state governments so that states cannot exert undue control over the lives of the citizens. In other words, there are limits on what the state governments can do. Excuse me just a moment. The third section of the 14th Amendment, the third goal of it was to require that laws be equal on their face and as administered, so that a law cannot say, for instance, black people would be treated this way and white people would be treated that way, nor can it be administered in that fashion. So that's equal protection, that the states will give the members of all classes the same treatment under the law. The fourth goal of the 14th Amendment was to prevent state governments from denying basic rights to their citizens. And the most basic rights are those we already know of. Those are in the Bill of Rights. These include rights that are founded, for instance, in the First Amendment that you're familiar with, or if you read the Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendment, those rights of criminal defendants. And also of voting, which is not specifically listed in the Bill of Rights, but all of these will be substantive laws that are subject to the due process guarantees of the first paragraph of the 14th Amendment. And finally, the fifth goal I've listed is that it sets up the federal government as the protector of these rights. If a state is discriminating against an individual in violation of the Equal Protection Clause or the Due Process Clause, it will be the federal Department of Justice who's supposed to come in and prosecute that state. It's the federal courts that have a forum available to these individuals and to the federal government for purposes of um, of fixing the law and enforcing it. If you notice right now, a lot of this work is being done at the federal district court level. If you look in the papers just in the last week or the last month or the last couple of years, you'll see a whole lot of federal courts acting inside their own states where they operate against the state legislature and state laws of that own state. Let's go to the next slide. Well, due process is both procedural and substantive, meaning it has to do with how a case works through the courts, but it also has to do with the substantive rights that we just talked about. Under procedural due process, an individual is not subject to the arbitrary exercises of the power of a state government. Instead, the rule of law is applied equally to people who are similarly situated. So, a protected interest, which we know is life, liberty, or property, when that's at stake, the government has to observe at least these things. There's got to be notice to the individual that what he owns or what he is trying to achieve is going to be adjudicated. The adjudication does not occur in his absence. Secondly, he's got a right to be heard in a fair setting. And if you go back and look at the Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendments, Seventh Amendments, you'll see there's a whole lot of doctrine there about what is fair. Jury trials, representation by an attorney, speedy trial, the idea that the jury has to be of your peers, that the judge has to be impartial, that the jury should be impartial. These are all procedural due process rights that now are incumbent on the state. They were part of the Bill of Rights, incumbent against the federal government by people. Now it's against the states by the same people. And the idea of liberty and justice for all comes from the early cases under the 14th Amendment. And let's move forward and take a quick look at equal protection. What does that mean? State governments may not arbitrarily discriminate against individuals. So African Americans clearly were kind of the intended target of the 14th Amendment. The language, however, is not limited to any one racial or other group. It has been expanded to include gender and to include a country of origin. The equal protection standard now applies to classifications not only by Congress and state legislatures, but other official bodies, county governments, state commissions, transportation commissions, that kind of thing. They all have to obey the 14th Amendment. Legislative classifications that involve a characteristic that we sort of inherently suspect that a state government may be discriminating against them based on their membership in that group, such as sex or race, are more likely to be the law that is going to be understood and interpreted under the Equal Protection Clause that prohibits unequal discrimination against individuals because of their membership in what's called a suspect class. So let's move to the next slide. Well, still, a lot of states did not give the right to vote to people who had been previously enslaved. So we got the 15th Amendment, which frankly was a little bit weak. It does say that persons cannot be denied the right to vote on account of race or color or previous condition of servitude, but it didn't say that the states couldn't have poll taxes, literacy tests, and what was called a grandfather clause that said, if your grandfather couldn't vote, you can't vote. Those will all be done away with over time, but the South and maybe even some other states continue to try to keep poor people who were primarily Black people from taking part in civic government. For a little while, there were quite a few Blacks who did make it into state government. The South Carolina state legislature for a while had an enormous number of young Black people who became decision makers, rule makers in the state Congress. But state by state, the state governments shut this down. And unfortunately, the federal government did not do very much to enforce the law as we know it in the 14th Amendment, again, until about the 1950s, 1960s. Let's move forward. Well, we're going to talk a little bit about um, the idea of separate but equal and Brown versus School Board, but we've got a couple of minutes here. Does anybody have a question that you would like to cover about what we've talked about so far? If not, let's move forward. This is a painting of the Treme district, which is a neighborhood north of the French Quarter in New Orleans. It had been a magnet for free Southern blacks over many, many decades. And it was a place where a lot of folks who wanted to change the law and make it more equitable lived. And out of this area came a man named Plessy, who decided, he was a part of a group who decided to test a law, and it was a Louisiana transportation law that said that black people couldn't sit in the front cars of a railway train. They had to sit in a back car, a colored car. Well, Plessy was 7/8 white and 1/8. He was what people called an octoroon at the time. He was 1/8 black, so he was white enough that he could buy a ticket. But he got to the car, to the train, and sat down in the very front car. And a conductor came on and said, "Is anybody here of any Negro blood?" And Plessy stood up and he said, "Yes, I am." And the conductor said, "Well, you have to get off the train." And he said, "No, I'm not going to do it." And as a result, a mob of white people threw him off the train and he was arrested at the next stop. Well, the interesting backstory to this case, which will become Plessy versus Ferguson, was that the conductor and Plessy were both plants. They were acting. They were testing this law. And in order for the law to be tested, they had to have a violation of it. And Plessy, who could pass as white, was able to buy a ticket and then claim his blackness, say that he wouldn't get off the train, get arrested, and take that ticket to court. This case will go all the way to the Supreme Court. And let's look at the next slide. In 1896, the case of Plessy versus Ferguson makes it to the Supreme Court. And what the Supreme Court unfortunately says is that racial segregation laws don't violate the Constitution because they're providing a separate place for blacks to enjoy the very same benefit that whites enjoyed in their, for instance, train cars or their restaurants or restrooms or drinking fountains or schools. In reality, the separate facilities were never equal. After 1896, states throughout the Union got around the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment by using separate facilities. And the majority opinion reads like so many 19th century Supreme Court decisions where it could have been written by the Klan. The majority opinion says that the object of the 14th Amendment was undoubtedly to enforce the absolute equality of the two races before the law, but the nature of things, that could never be true. In other words, what they're saying is, even though the Congress and 3/4 of the states said that it is now true, that there is now equal protection of all citizens are equal and there are no second-class citizens, it could not have been intended to abolish distinctions based on color or commingling of the two races. So even if it is the law, it can't be the way it is because that's not what nature is. Let's move to the next slide. Plessy versus Ferguson goes on to say the underlying fallacy of Plessy's argument is that they assume that the enforced separation of the two races means that the colored race is inferior. But that's not true. There's nothing that says they're inferior. It's solely because the colored race chooses to put that construction on it. Well, in reality, the difference between the white room and the black room was distinct. There was a strong dissent from the great dissenter, Justice Harlan, who says, in view of the law, there is no superior, dominant, or ruling class. We have no castes. Our Constitution is colorblind. In respect to civil rights, all citizens are equal before the law, and the humblest is the pure, the most powerful. This almost reads like red letter law out of the Gospels. The humblest is the pure, the most powerful. Sounds almost like something Jesus would say. The law regards man as man and takes no account of his surroundings or his color when civil rights are guaranteed by the supreme law. Well, that dissent will become law, but it will take a long time. Let's move to the next slide because it's going to be about 60 years later before, and you see the shadow of Thurgood Marshall in the back of this slide. Thurgood Marshall was an attorney who brought some 30 cases to the Supreme Court and won almost all of them. He represented the NAACP, and his most famous win was Brown versus School Board. What Justice Earl Warren, who was new to the court in 1954 or 55 when it came down, said was that in reality, these schools are not equal. They cannot be made equal, and therefore equal protection is denied by the very notion of separate but equal. And Warren goes forward. He says, we can't go back to 1868. We can't go back to Plessy versus Ferguson. We must consider public education in light of its full development here in American life right now. And the only way to get rid of separate but equal is to affect segregation. And he goes on to talk of there was a great deal of expert testimony during these trials where sociologists and psychologists came in and said that Black children were not learning as fast, that they were being isolated in these schools that were inferior. And let's move to the next slide and we'll kind of pick up on some of what he says in the bold letter. Segregation of white and colored children in public schools has a detrimental effect upon the colored kids. A sense of inferiority affects the motivation of a child to learn. And he goes on and he basically says, this is what we were trying to repair back in 1868. So I show you Plessy versus Ferguson and Brown versus School Board to reinforce the importance of the 14th Amendment, just like the First Amendment, in talking about how it affects and molds our culture. Our culture today is based on equality. We talk about it all the time. And really, it comes from law all the way back, just following the Civil War. Let's move to the next slide. What about this word equality in U.S. history? Well, if we go all the way back to 1690, and remember we talked about John Locke, the philosopher, who said that all people equal and independent kind of have these same property rights. And these property rights are inalienable. They can't be transferred to a government. Remember, this is how the First Amendment is written. We own these things, and Congress shall make no law disturbing our rights to them, because you can't take away freedom of conscience, freedom of speech. They're already ours. That's what he was saying. We're all equal. We all have these things. In the Declaration in 1776, Jefferson goes forward and he says, all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator to these unalienable rights, among those life, liberty. And he talks about the pursuit of happiness, which Locke had called property and health. The 14th Amendment in 1868, as you know, talks about equal protection. And finally, we get to the mid-50s, Brown versus School Board, when we learn that the doctrine of separate but equal has no place because separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. There's the evolution of the word equal from 1690 to the middle part of the last century. And now let's go to the next slide. And I believe where we are now is Nighthawks. Hopper, 1941. Also a cultural icon. While we're sitting with Hopper for a minute, are there any questions about what we have covered so far? And then we'll move to privacy, which is also a 14th Amendment creation. Go ahead. This is a good time for questions if you have any. All right, we got 10 or 15 minutes left. Let's hit it real quickly. Privacy law begins all the way back in 1890 with a law review article written by Louis Brandeis, who later will become a very influential Supreme Court justice. Oh, by the way, speaking of Supreme Court justices, I meant to mention that Thurgood Marshall, who argued Brown versus School Board, would become the first Black Supreme Court justice. He was the Solicitor General. That's the guy that represents the president in front of the Supreme Court under Lyndon Johnson, and Lyndon Johnson makes him the first black Supreme Court justice in 1967 or 68. He had an extremely distinguished career, um, doing for blacks what Ruth Bader Ginsburg later will do for women. Now let's move forward. Brandeis will also become an important Supreme Court justice, but he writes this law review article back in 1890 with a colleague of his where he says, you know what, there should be a right to privacy. And he was thinking that the states would establish a right to privacy so that newspaper editors couldn't write things about people that would disturb them. But he doesn't quite get to the idea of privacy coming out of the Constitution. For that, we need to go about another 35 years, and we get to this. Go ahead, Mercy. And this is a cornfield. This is a corn and soybean field in east central Nebraska. And believe it or not, the right to privacy is going to come out of a little church, a little Lutheran evangelical church on the plains of east central Nebraska, surrounded by corn. Privacy will eventually give us the right of privacy in our own bedrooms to prevent the state from controlling birth control. It will give us privacy to allow us to marry who we want, both interracial marriages and same-sex marriages. It will give us privacy in the phone booth. Privacy will become an extremely important part of our lives. Why does it begin in the cornfields of east central Nebraska? Well, there was a guy named Robert Meyer who was a mild-mannered German teacher. And he came to this little school and he taught German, I believe, once a week. He had a student who was, I believe, 10 years old. And one day he's teaching his student in the little schoolhouse, and in walks the sheriff and arrests him for teaching German. It's like 1920, right after the First World War. There's a lot of anti-German animus in the United States, and Nebraska is a very German state. And even they had passed this law. Let's move forward. Even the Nebraska legislature had passed a law which said that nobody can teach any language other than English to kids who haven't yet passed the 8th grade. And let's move to the next slide. The Nebraska Supreme Court hears the case of Meyer versus Nebraska. So Robert Meyer gets a ticket. He takes it up to the Nebraska Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court defends its own legislature's law. It says the statute is clear. Obviously, there's a good reason for it. And what they basically say is, we don't want these kids growing up thinking German thoughts. We don't want them thinking French thoughts or Italian thoughts. If they're going to be American kids, we want them learning English and English only, and therefore they will think like Americans. The last sentence of the first paragraph, it was to educate them so that they must always think in their own language. As a consequence, naturally inculcate them in ideas and sentiments not foreign to the best interests of their country. If you read the whole thing, you'll see that how it's couched. Well, it goes to the U.S. Supreme Court. This is 1923, so 100 years ago. And the U.S. Supreme Court says the problem for our study here is whether the Nebraska statute unreasonably infringes on the liberty guarantee to the plaintiff, the German teacher, by the 14th Amendment, where the 14th Amendment says that no state shall deprive any person of liberty without due process. Well, what is his liberty interest? His liberty interest was to earn a living. What about the liberty interest of the kid whose parents sent him to this school to learn German? Let's move to the next slide. In Meyer versus Nebraska in 1923, the Supreme Court said that the 14th Amendment due process clause is based on liberty, and Justice McReynolds writes this beautiful opinion. He states that liberty, as protected by due process, without a doubt denotes not merely the freedom from bodily restraint. Well, we talked about that. Liberty means not going to jail, but also the right of an individual to contract, to engage in any common occupation, to acquire useful knowledge, to marry. Look at that little inf infinitive right there, to marry. That will become very important as we begin looking at the marriage cases. He's quoting natural law. He says that the 14th Amendment gives us liberty to establish a home and bring up children to worship God according to dictates of our own conscience. That's the First Amendment. To generally enjoy the privileges long recognized at common law is essential to the orderly pursuit of happiness by free men. Who's he talking about? What's he talking about? Who is this? He's talking about John Locke. He's going back to natural law. He's saying these are the things that we have that government doesn't get simply by us becoming citizens, just like the First Amendment. In fact, he even talks about the First Amendment a little bit here. He says to worship God according to the dictates of our own conscience. That's the first phrase of the First Amendment, isn't it? So he's saying we got to look at who we are as a people. What does man own irrespective of government? Let's go to the next slide because 2 years later, the state of Oregon does something strikingly similar. Oregon comes out with a law that says that if there is a public school in the area, kids in Oregon have to go to it. They can't go to a parochial school. And a Catholic school, the Society of Sisters, sues the governor of Oregon, and the case goes again to the Supreme Court. This is 1925, again, just 100 years ago. And they rely on Meyer, and they say, down here in the bold print, the fundamental theory of liberty upon which all governments in the Union lie excludes any general power of the state to standardize its children by forcing them to accept instruction of a certain type. A child is not a creature of the state. We do not standardize our kids. A child is a creature of a family. Those who nurture him and direct his destiny have the right, the power, and the duty to prepare him for additional obligations as they see fit. These two cases, Meyer and Pierce, will become, however unlikely they were coming out of parochial schools in the West, they will become the basis for privacy law for the next 100 years. And let's move forward real quickly. We'll take a look at what all happened. The word privacy is not in the Constitution, but it's typically described as the right to be left alone. In other words, that the state does not involve itself in our personal affairs. As I mentioned earlier, family planning, choice of marital partners, choice of domestic partners, sexual preference, abortion, whether for any variety of reasons, all emanate from the liberty due process language of the 14th Amendment, as well as the First, Third, Fifth, and Ninth. Let's take a look at those. The First Amendment you're aware of. The Third Amendment says that the federal government cannot quarter troops in our houses. Well, that's a privacy idea, isn't it? The Fourth Amendment says that police cannot invade our houses without a warrant, searching for evidence. That's certainly an idea of liberty and privacy. The Fifth Amendment says you don't have to testify against yourself. The Ninth Amendment says, as you know, that certain unenumerated rights are retained for the people. By the way, there are a lot of words like the word privacy that are not in the Constitution, but yet we enjoy them. The word democracy is not in the Constitution. Neither is the term separation of church and state, but you see it came from a letter of Thomas Jefferson and has been picked up as the law. If you read one through the Fourth, Fifth, Sixth, and Seventh Amendments, you see that innocent until proven guilty is not there, but it is the law. The word education is nowhere in the Constitution. It was given over to the states. Freedom of association comes from the First Amendment right of freedom of peaceable assembly. Marriage, as you noted, is never stated in the Constitution, but it clearly is a natural right that we enjoy. And what about the Air Force? You saw that Article 1, Section 8 says we've got the power in Congress to create a Navy and an Army. Well, the Air Force, of course, comes much later. It will be read into the Constitution too. And let's move to the final group of slides real quickly and we'll wrap this up. There's some This slide is placed here for those of you who want to look at it later and read what natural rights did exist in the various states in 1868. Some justices on the Supreme Court say that you can't read things into the U.S. Constitution that aren't actually there in black and white. This is called originalism, and it's very similar to fundamental Christianity and only believing the exact words that are in the Bible, despite the fact that it's been interpreted and reinterpreted countless times. Well, if you want to take a look at this reference at the bottom of the page, it will talk about all these Lockean natural rights, which clearly existed in the states when the 14th Amendment became law. Let's move to the next slide, because I'd like to introduce you to some people here in just a second. But first, how far does the idea of privacy go? Well, in a dissent by another Harlan, who is a great dissenter, he says, there is no equation for determining what is a privacy right, but it is the freedom from all substantial, arbitrary impositions and purposeless restraints of a state or federal government. And we need to carefully scrutinize what the states are doing, because it clearly means something more than freedom from bodily restraint. I'd like to introduce you to a couple. Let's move to the next slide. These people, I keep wanting to get to the Lovings, but I have this other stuff. Griswold is the case where William Douglas said, state of Connecticut's got no interest telling people they cannot access birth control. And if you look at the paragraph that's bold, Douglas writes, these guarantees of liberty, privacy and liberty taken together, give life and substance to a broad inherent constitutional right against government intrusion of privacy. And this was a Planned Parenthood group that was handing out contraceptives to underprivileged women who had no way to keep from having more and more babies. And it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And it's really the beginning of how privacy law will occupy our bedrooms, which is a lot better than state government occupying our bedrooms. Let's move forward, because I keep wanting to introduce you to the Lovings. This is Mildred and Richard Loving. Mildred and Richard were high school sweethearts in Virginia. They got married in June of 1958, and they wake up one morning in July of 1958, and there's a flashlight on them in their bedroom, and there's a sheriff, R. Garnett Brooks, standing next to the bed and says, "What are you doing in bed with this woman?" And she wakes up and she points to the marriage certificate on the wall and says, "I'm his wife." They had been married for 5 weeks. Well, the sheriff got a tip that the black woman and a white man were living together. She was actually 1/8 black and 1/4 Native American and considered herself Native American. But according to Virginia state law, it was a crime for them to be married. They were arrested for violating Virginia's Racial Integrity Act. They were let off, but they were told they couldn't live in Virginia. They went to Washington, D.C., which, by the way, is where they had been married in June of 1958. They lived there until the mid-60s. They needed to move back because times were hard in D.C. and they wanted to live closer to their families. They moved back and they asked the court for permission to change the edict that had come out of this case. Let's move to the next slide. This case will attract the attention of the Attorney General under the Lyndon Johnson administration. Do you remember who that was? The Attorney General under the Lyndon Johnson administration was Robert F. Kennedy. And Kennedy gets a hold of this case, and he comes in on the side of the Lovings, an aptly named couple. They go before the Supreme Court, and in 1967, in what I believe was a unanimous decision, the Supreme Court says, even though the Virginia court reasoned that marriage had traditionally been the subject of state regulation, that cannot be true when the state uses its powers to regulate marriage in a way that don't comport with the 14th Amendment, because the Equal Protection Clause demands that racial classification be subject to the most rigid scrutiny. And when we apply strict scrutiny to the racial laws in Virginia in the 1950s and 1960s, they fail. Well, let's move forward, because what we'll see that at the stroke of a pen, 16 states lost their racial anti-miscegenation laws. And all of those states had to live with the fact that the law is the law. The law had been the law since 1868. Here we are 99 years later, and we finally get racial equality, at least with regard to marriage. Very briefly, moving forward to the last couple of slides, this will apply to marriage equality with regard to choice of partner. A decade ago, in 2015, and Justice Kennedy, who is the deciding vote and the vote and the voice who writes the Obergefell decision, says, my opponents who believe in originalism say that if the right wasn't defined at the time that the law was passed, 1868, there were no states that allowed gay marriage. They say that it cannot be the law now because when the law became law, we have to look at the environment in which it became the law. And there were no states that allowed gay marriage in 1868, and therefore there shouldn't be in 2015. But he says that retards the effect of the Equal Protection Clause and the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. It keeps other classes from coming forward. The right of same-sex couples to marry is part of the liberty promised by the 14th Amendment. And the continued jurisdiction of the 14th Amendment allows new groups to invoke rights that were once denied. And he goes back and he looks at some other law where they have done the same thing. Scalia, in dissent, says this isn't for the courts to legislate. This is up to the state legislatures because in 1868, no states allowed same-sex marriage. But this case stands for, and we'll move to our final slide now, stands for the idea that we have to balance in this country one power against another right. Governments have powers, individuals have rights. Individuals have liberty, and they have equal protection. And despite the fact that state legislatures can make laws which try to take away rights from individuals, the 14th Amendment is what we rely upon to balance out our rights with those powers, because under the Supremacy Clause, the 14th Amendment is more powerful than state laws. Moving to our very last slide, this is actually just a painting in the Metropolitan Museum of Art of a river in western Massachusetts where there's some fishermen in the foreground and some industry in the background, and it stands for the idea that all walks of life need to be balanced in our republic moving forward, just like the guy from Minnesota said in our very first slide, a true republic has no classes. All are equal, high, low, black, white, rich, and poor. So I've tried to give you in our first class a history of how we how we got the Constitution in the first place. In the second class, the First Amendment, which forms our rights of consciousness and our rights of speech and protest. And now in the 14th Amendment, here's where equality and liberty come from as enforceable by individuals against the government. Thanks a lot for letting me do this, Marcy. Now we have time for questions. I think if anybody wants to stick around, I'm happy to take your questions.
We do have time, Greg. Thank you so much. Anybody want to put questions in chat or jump off of mute and ask a question? Please feel free to do so.
This is Diane. I would just like to say again, thank you, Greg. Thank you. Thank you. It's just, again, it's mind blowing. And thank you for putting it in words, ways we can understand. It gives me a whole new perspective on things of having conversations with people now that I know more about those two amendments. So, it's one of the best classes I've ever taken. So thank you. Really, really, really. I really appreciate it.
Oh, Dan, that's very, very nice. Thank you very much, my friend. I would hope that this will spur all of you on to know that you now understand a lot about the U.S. Constitution and you can access more and more of it. There are more classes out there. One of the best classes is just reading the newspaper, reading analyses from the court reporters who are going to tell you what's going on. not just the Supreme Court, because a lot of the work is being done at the federal district court level and the federal circuit court level. Thanks so much for that compliment, Diane. I appreciate it.
Take care.
Anybody else? I'll tell you, Greg, what's hard for me is that the manner in which you have explained it almost like made me fall in love with my country again. I feel incredibly proud of the development, um, and then I'm also just rage filled, when you got to the due process stuff, and I think about what's happening in Charlotte, and so it's like hard to hold both of those things, like just the beauty of this document, which I think you really showed us, and the potential of this document to really help a society flourish and help individuals flourish, and then to see how we're not living into it in these days, right? So holding both of those, it's something else.
We are in a tough time for the Constitution, but I'm really reminded of something our friend Paul Gibbs said. And Paul, I see you on here. At the Knights of the Square table when we were together, he said, Greg, you give me an optimistic view of the Constitution, right, Paul?
Mhm.
And the fact is,
Yeah.
it is an optimistic document. There are times when it is interpreted pessimistically. I think the current court is not representative of past courts. You've seen some brilliant decisions made by some very courageous Supreme Court justices. And then there have been some awful ones. By the way, the history of the court in the 19th century is just deplorable. It really is deplorable. The Dred Scott case, the Plessy versus Ferguson case, two cases where the Supreme Court, and in both cases, I think it was the Chief Justices, said, we don't care what the law is. We don't care what the Constitution says. We're going to do what we want to do. We don't really care. And I think maybe we've seen a little bit of that so far with this court. A lot of these decisions that it has come out with that are unpopular with me and people like me are decisions which are interim decisions. They have very, very short life. We're in their life right now. These decisions, some of them are going to start getting reviewed on the merits, on the substance of the law, starting this term. In fact, we've got the tariff case coming up it'll be announced fairly soon. The tariff case was upheld back at the district. It was ruled that Trump didn't have the power he's exerting at the district court level. And then that decision was stayed by the Supreme Court. But now the trial on the merits has been had. Now the argument on the merits is in the record for the Supreme Court to make a decision on.
Yeah.
So we might see some change. Hi, Marilee.
Hi.
Did you have a
Just want-
question?
No, I don't really about this, but I just wanted to share with everybody else. Paul and I've been watching Ken Burns' series on the Constitution, on the Revolutionary War, but also on the Civil War, and a lot of that ties in what you've been saying about rights and things.
Yeah.
And it also, Marcy, makes you proud of our country.
Yeah, and Lincoln was an amazing person. You know, he was anti-slavery. He detested slavery, but he didn't think it was his job to change the Constitution
He didn't think it
until
was
he
his
got,
power.
I'm
He
sorry?
didn't think it was within his power.
He didn't think it was until they got the bright idea of doing what they did, and it works perfectly. It does not violate the U.S. Constitution. They just said, hey, we got these forts down here, and really it broke the South. It broke the South in a number of ways. The North had a whole bunch of new soldiers who were eager, and they also had the South economic infrastructure would suffer from it, from the slaves leaving.
I also want to bring up, Sandra put in the chat that Strict Scrutiny is a really interesting podcast about the Supreme Court. So thank you for that, Sandra.
I love Strict Scrutiny. It's my favorite podcast. Three professors from really good law schools who are outspoken about the current administration, and they cover the Supreme Court. In fact, they have practiced in front of the Supreme Court and testified in front of Congress. These three they are able to explain what's going on at the Supreme Court in terms that I think all of us can understand. The idea of strict scrutiny, by the way, that term means the highest level of oversight that the Supreme Court applies to a state law. So when it affects the rights of individuals, or when it treats two different groups of people separately for no good reason, for no what's called rational purpose, the Supreme Court will apply a test called strict scrutiny to that state law, and it almost always means that that state law will die because it's got to show the state has to show a very high level of, they've just got to show a high level of discretion in order to keep that law alive. Plus, they have a very good sense of humor. Yeah, they are hilarious.
Right.
And they're angry. They're very, very angry. If you're angry, Strict Scrutiny is a good podcast to listen to.
Okay.
Shirley, I think you have a question,
Yeah,
huh?
sure.
Yeah, I do. You referred in one of your slides to the originalists, and I wonder if you could just say a little more about that. But we in recent years we hear a lot more about the originalists, and I thought your short list of some of the things that don't appear in the Constitution was interesting. I'd like to know then, do they, therefore, the real originalists, not believe in those particular phrases like separation of church and state or democracy, as you said? And I also wonder if the Federalist Society is just a group of originalists, or is it broader than that?
I cannot speak to the Federalist Society. I know they have pushed the names of certain nominees for Supreme Court before the presidency, and I know that's one of several things they do. Originalism is this idea that the Constitution should be interpreted as it was understood, as the words of the phrase being looked at were understood at the time it became law. So there are some fairly good originalist decisions. If you want to read the Heller case by Justice Scalia, Scalia is a really clever originalist, and he seems to know how far originalism should go and when not to use it. In fact, he said, I'm an originalist, but I'm not a dummy or something like that. If you want to read a really bad originalist decision, it's by there are a couple, three of them. One is Dobbs, that overturned Roe v. Wade, by Justice Alito. But there's a really awful one, and it's Bruen, Bruen, that it was written by Justice Thomas. And it's a gun case that came down a few years ago that absolutely makes no sense. I can't go into it right now, but if you want to find an article just do a search for the differences between Heller and Bruen. I think you'll find they're both gun cases. Heller is a case that is an originalist case, but it makes a lot of sense. Bruen is an originalist gun case that it cannot work. It doesn't work. And it's the law right now. It goes so far as to say, or at least one court said, well, the Bruen case tells us that we have to look at the Second Amendment at the time it became law in 1791. And because there were no protective orders in 1791, there can be no protective orders against boyfriends who wield guns and maybe take a shot in the air in the presence of their girlfriends in 2021. That's how bad it got. That was a case called Rahimi. Now, Rahimi finally goes up to the Supreme Court the year after Bruen, and finally, no less than John Roberts, who's not known for being very, I don't know, very equal in his interpretations, kind of rewrites Bruen and says, well, wait a minute. It cannot be that simply because there were no protective orders in 1791, there can be no protective orders in 2020. We see that there were laws that prevented certain people from wielding guns in public. And that's enough for us to say, yes, you can have a protective order against an ex-boyfriend or an ex-husband who's been in jail and gets out of jail and he's not allowed to touch a gun under the Second Amendment. There are just some crazy laws that come down, I'm sorry, Supreme Court cases that come down under the idea of originalism because it's absurd. It's the absurd notion that the law could never grow. And if you take a look at one of the very last slides I put up here, the slide where Justice Kennedy is talking about his decision in Obergefell, he's kind of taking a jab at originalism. He says, well, wait a minute, times change. Equal protection has got to mean something. Just because the state of, New York or Arkansas didn't allow for marriage equality in 1868 doesn't mean we don't allow for it today. So those are the two different ideas. The second school is called the living constitution, and the first school is typically referred to as textualism or originalism. And there's a whole lot of very detailed study you can read about that. But originalism, to answer your question, Shirley, is the idea that a phrase has to be interpreted as the words were commonly used at the time it became the law. Which, by the way, nobody knows. 1791, we really don't have that much eyewitness testimony what the term right to bear arms meant in 1791 or what the term militia meant in 1791. So that's just another reason that originalism is inoperable. It doesn't work very well. Thanks for the soapbox. I appreciate the question.
It seems to me that there's a lot of picking and choosing if they're going to say they're relying on originalism, that there are certain things they wouldn't tackle, but and so it's something that appeals to their particular bent.
Yeah, Justices Jackson and Kagan and Sotomayor have been pointing that out now for several years. Exactly. It's a pick and choose kind of thing, and this court is famous for that.
And do we have a reason why it's not in the Constitution of how we can get rid of Supreme Court justices?
Um, who asked the question?
Shirley.
Oh, Shirley, hi. I see you there. I just couldn't see your face. Yeah, because Supreme Court justices are appointed for life. That's in Article 3. And what Alexander Hamilton said in the Federalist Papers is we don't want to make them worry about whether they're going to get reappointed or not. They're too busy telling us, what the law is. We shouldn't distract them with ideas like popularity and electability.
But it seems like they bent over backwards to try to understand that a president might get carried away with the powers and he needed some constraints built in on his abilities, what he could do. But they didn't recognize the same thing about the Supreme Court needing some constraints.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And if you look at Roe v. Wade, which becomes law in 1973, and you look at the court, which existed in 1973 compared to the Dobbs court 3 years ago, it was just a much more balanced court back then. I think we had a better view of things. There was a wonderful court that existed for just a few years. There were three people right in the middle, and it was oftentimes known as the O'Connor Court, even though Rehnquist was a Supreme Court justice. Sandra Day O'Connor, the first woman on the court, was a very balanced voice. And along with Justices Kennedy and I think it was Souter, there was this central part of that court that was very much middle of the road. They were moderates. There are no moderates on today's court. There were three conservatives, three liberals, and three moderates. And some of the decisions that came down under what I call the O'Connor court were very, very good, very well written, very well balanced. Justice O'Connor was a very good Supreme Court justice. But today, we have six conservatives and three liberals, and I don't think you're seeing a lot of balance. Once in a while, you'll see John Roberts or one of the others kind of cross the line and says, wait a minute, somebody's got to be the adult in the room here. And that's why we got the Rahimi decision that rewrote Bruin to some extent.
I don't know that a moderate would make it through the Senate.
Well, I think it would.
Do you think?
I think it's possible. Hey, let me give you a book reference,
Yeah.
which comes out of today's lecture. The Second Founding, Founding, The Second Founding by a man named Eric Foner, Foner. Eric Foner is now emeritus at Columbia in constitutional history, constitutional law. And he describes better than anybody how the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments come along and kind of what the purpose was of them at the time. And then you
Greg,
might
is
want,
that how the Civil War and Reconstruction remade the Constitution?
yeah,
Okay.
The Second Founding, by Eric Foner. Um, and then there's a much later volume called The Unwritten Constitution, and I haven't read it in a few years. It comes from Harvard, a Harvard professor. It's not Tribe, it's one of the other guys, that really explains why we have so much law that's not written down in the Constitution. The unwritten Constitution will talk about some of the things I talked about tonight, how we get, for instance, ideas of privacy. Even though the word doesn't appear in the Constitution, it clearly emanates from First, Third, Fourth, Fifth, and Ninth and 14th Amendments.
Mhm. Yeah. Okay, Greg, I'm gonna call it. We're gonna let you go. You have given us so much over 3 evenings. So thank
Great.
you so much for offering to do this for us. What an incredibly gracious gift to the community. So thank you so much for doing this.
Well,
Thanks.
I'm so
We
honored.
appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody. I'm so honored to now be a member of your church and making friends with so many of you, and hope to remain active in the congregation. Thanks.
Very blessed to have you. Okay, good night,
Night,
everyone.
Lindsay. Hi, Lindsay.
Care.
Night, everybody. Take care.
Night.
Night,
Thank
Paul.
you, Greg.